Hey everyone, how's it going? This is the Bold Metal Nerd coming at you with another awesome, wonderful video. This one I'm going to be talking about the overall trends of my life, kind of what's happened to me over the 2010s, and I will be talking about larger social trends as well, not just me specifically, but kind of everything. I will try to go relatively compacted. I'm not going to go over excruciating details. I also am going to talk a little bit about previous decades as well, but I'll try to condense those down a pretty significant amount till we get to the kind of relevant bits here of the 2010s. And then, of course, at the end, I'm going to talk about what I anticipate happening in the 2020s. So let's go. I was born in 1978, so clearly I don't remember 1978 or 1979 at all, right? I literally have no memory of it. Of course, I don't remember, January 1st, 1980 either. My memories begin sometime in the 1980s, right? So, what did that decade, how did it form me as a person? Well, obviously, during that decade, I was a child. And I had a relatively quote-unquote normal childhood, I would think. At the time, when the decade started, my mother had divorced my biological father. The last time I saw him, I was 4 years old. And I literally never saw him again. From age 4 onwards, that was it. He was completely out of my life. My mother got remarried when I was 6 years old. You would call him my stepdad, but I'd think of him as my father because he was always around, and that's essentially, they moved in together, obviously, after they got married, and I lived the vast majority of the 1980s with my mother and my stepdad. Prior to that, I lived with my mother and grandparents. Probably the most significant thing that, at least shaped this YouTube channel, of course, was my discovery of heavy metal in 1989 at age 11. Right? If that had never happened, well, I wouldn't be, being the, quote, bald metal nerd today. That never would have happened if I had not gotten into heavy metal. So, there you go. That was kind of the origin of me listening to the music that I love so much. As far as like big trends that happened in the 1980s, I think, is the most recent time that there was a massive political shift in this country, right? And of course, that political shift was due to Ronald Reagan, right? When he became president, the Overton window was shifted extremely to, the right. Well, I'm not camera. I got to go to the left to make it look. Yeah, it shifted to the extreme right compared to where it was. Before that, it was definitely in a different place. And because of that, after Reagan, even Democratic presidents really just acted like Republicans. So to say the man had an absolutely gigantic impact on U.S. politics, no doubt about it, right? So, and really since then, things have largely been viewed. Cracks are starting to appear, but we'll get to that when we get to the more modern times. But yeah, that's when we had this massive shift, and it's kind of stayed over there since. And of course, the biggest technological change of the 1980s, of course, is the PC, right? That's the decade that the PC kind of matured into a thing. That was, of course, when the IBM PC debuted and personal computers really started to become fairly commonplace, right? So that was the 1980s. So when 1990 rolled around, yes, obviously, I was aware that the decade had changed. The 90s is the decade, personally, for me, when I came of age. I was an older child to teenager to / young adult that decade. So for me, it was the coming of age decade. The biggest change for me in that decade were a couple things. One was obviously just growing up, um, maturing, and moving out of my parents' house. I moved out of my parents' house in it was either 98 or 99. I can't remember which. I think 1998. And that's just when I struck out on my own, so to speak. That's also roughly the same time I met my first wife, my ex-wife, in that decade as well. I'm pretty sure I met her in 1999. Again, it's a little fuzzy. Yeah, it was 99 when I met her. So back then I still had hair. So the bald part was not yet true. Was I a nerd? Absolutely. But I wasn't yet bald. What else? I obviously went to college. Blah, blah, blah. Normal, real young adult stuff. Let's see. And of course, the biggest technological trend of the 90s is, I would say, probably the most important technological trend of the last 100 years, and that of course is the decade the internet became very commonplace. And it literally exploded and was everywhere. And of course, politically, where we were in the 90s, I'd say was largely a reaction to the 80s, but kind of similar. We were still, obviously that was the decade of Bill Clinton's presidency, but we were still largely defined through that Reagan-esque political scope, even during the Clinton years. I don't think Clinton really shifted the window back towards the left. It was still pretty far on the right, even during his presidency. So that's kind of where we were in the 90s, and I was 21 years old when they ended. So obviously, when I was 21, now we're going to talk about the 2000s. Of course, I was pretty well aware of what was going on. The 2000s for me, the biggest changes that happened during the 2000s were, well, that's when I became the bald metal nerd, because I'll explain what started that. I got my first house in 2001. That's when I bought my first home. I was still with my ex-wife at the time. I was with my ex-wife until 2005. And when I was with my ex-wife, she would often encourage me to shave my head. And when I was with her, for some reason, I simply refused to do it. Stubbornness, stupidity, who knows what. Because a year or two prior to that, that's when I realized I was actually starting to really lose my hair, because we went to a Dayton Air Show together, and for the first time ever, the top of my head got sunburned. So that was kind of a signal to me that this was becoming a little bit of a dead zone up here. But yeah, as soon as me and my ex-wife split up, I started shaving my head, and that was in 2005. Let's see what else happened that was big for me that decade. I'm just trying to think. Getting divorced from my wife was obviously a gigantic thing. I had to sell my first house. And then I met my current wife in 2007 is when we met. We didn't get married until 2009, but that's when I met her. So yeah, obviously that was a pretty big transitional time for me. Oh, also probably one of the, besides my two wives. Oh, and I bought my current house in the 2000s as well. So 2000s were obviously a pretty active decade for me. Oh, also that is when my career in IT started. That's when I finally got into the field of being in 2004. Yeah, 2004 is when I started in the IT field, and I've been there ever since. For several years after college and stuff, I kind of drifted from job to job, nothing related to IT. But when I was working at one job, they asked me if I wanted to do the IT work, and I said sure, and well, I've been doing it ever since. So, tons of change for me in the 2000s. And that was pretty much how that went down. And the 2000s, again, were obviously probably the single biggest event of the 2000s, of course, was 9/11. It really shaped the decade. We've been in perpetual war now for 18 years. The war is old enough to vote at this point, which is obviously a terrible shame. And I think in the 2000s, a bit of the veneer of that Reagan-esque style politics was starting to break down a bit. It was starting to fade away, be chipped away just a little bit. Obviously, that was the decade when we had George Bush as president, for most of it. And, we had, of course, the great economic crash of 2008. And all sorts of wonderful things happened in the 2000s. And it was definitely not a great decade. And it set the stage for, what would come this past decade. It was definitely a huge thing. And in 2008, for the first time, we had a political figure that promised actual, real, substantial change, but of course utterly failed to deliver. And of course, I'm talking about Barack Obama. He was elected on a wave of, hey, I'm going to make hope change, hope change, hope change. And, well, obviously, we didn't get much real change with Obama. So anyway, that was that decade in a nutshell, which of course brings us to the most recent one. Finally getting to the 2010s, several minutes into this video. I apologize. But, so I was obviously 31 years old when the 2010s started. And what happened there was, well, a very interesting decade, and I mean that, of course, in the worst possible way. The 2010s, I think, is when that 1980s politics is complete. It's completely obliterated now. After Obama's second term, we saw there was no change, and after that, people are, I think, this decade really waking up to the status quo is just doesn't work. That's why Trump got elected, I believe. Because people are hunting for change, they're desperate for change, they're hungry for change. And Trump sold himself as change, even though he's really just governing like a standard Republican for the most part. He sold himself as something that he's totally not, and people believed it. But whatever, that's neither here nor there. As for me personally in the 2010s, again, another decade of a lot of change for me personally. It's the decade, obviously. I started this YouTube channel. I started it in 2015, February of 2015 to be precise. But of course, a much bigger change happened than this silly little YouTube channel that I had. The biggest change for me personally this decade, of course, was becoming a father. I got, 2 girls this decade. Let's see. They are now 9 and 17. And when they arrived, they were 4 and 12, respectively. So that would have been 2014 is when the girls rolled into my life. I've told this story a few times, but I'll go ahead and just tell it again real quick. At the time, me and my wife had considered being foster parents for some certain girls that are somehow directly or indirectly related to my wife. I'm not sure exactly how that works. We had gotten through doing some of the preparation to become foster parents. That all fell through. And then my wife said, "Hey, do you just want to go all the way and become fully licensed foster parents?" I'm like, "Sure, why not?" So we basically complete the training. After we do that, we start. There's this website to talk about children that are available for adoption. So we had been looking at this website. We actually talked with a few social workers about a few of these children that were up for adoption. None of it happened. We never even met any of the children who were up for adoption. And then one day, out of the clear blue, we get a phone call that there are these two girls that need a place to go. We get a call, "Hey, we have these two girls, 4 and 12. They were in a bad situation. Can you take them? We need a temporary housing for them." And we said, "Sure, of course, we'll do it." I mean, because we wanted to get our feet wet as foster parents, right? Well, the girls never left, obviously. The parents lost all custody to the children due to some criminal activities. I won't go into detail. But yeah, they were obviously completely out of the picture. And then once that happened, they said, "Will you adopt the girls?" And by this point, the girls had already been with us for 2 years. Yeah, they had been with us for 2 years. So we said, "Yeah, of course, we'll adopt them." So hence we adopted the girls. Um, as far as the younger one, she acclimated to the family really well, fairly quickly, because she was only 4 years old when she showed up, and it's a lot easier to acclimate a child of that age into a new family than an older child. The older child, the 12-year-old, frankly, was an extreme problem from the beginning. Uh, Nothing but fighting and attitude and just everything. The older one has caused us a lot of problems. We've had the police show up a few times because of her. We've had DCS show up a few times because of her. We've had lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of problems out of the older one. Now, recently, the older one, in July of this year, actually, I mean, we're still responsible for her. We're still her guardians, but she no longer lives in our house full time. We actually enrolled her in the Job Corps program, and she actually lives at a campus in Cincinnati, Ohio. So basically, it's like she's away at college, more or less. She's actually currently with us right now. She's here through January 6th. So she's currently upstairs in her room reading or something right now, I guess. But that's the story with the older one. And surprisingly, since she's been here these past couple of weeks, we've gotten along a lot better, really, with her than we ever have before. So, and she appears to be doing relatively well in the program. So, putting her into the program was the best thing we could have done for her. She seems to be thriving there and frankly doing a lot better than she ever did here, which is fantastic. I obviously want her to succeed. As a parent, my job is to try to make sure that my children succeed. That I think is probably just the most important job you can have as a parent. Of course, love that all the things that go with them. Provide a stable environment, love them, provide support, yada 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 yada. But essentially, you want your children to be successful. However, success is defined for them because they have to define their own success. You don't define it for them, but basically for them to become functional adults, right? And I think my 17-year-old is actually on the path towards becoming that sort of an adult, which is great. So that's my biggest change for the 2010s, which is obviously a gigantic change. As far as overall social trends of the 2010s, I think the piece of technology that had the biggest influence on the 2010s, of course, is the smartphone. Yes, they existed before, but the 2010s is when everyone got a smartphone, and it's transformed our society quite a bit. As far as social trends go, all that veneer that I was talking about, the 1980s style politics, I think at this point is completely dead for the most part. We now see on, ironically enough, the Democrats are the ones who are still kind of holding on to that centrism, neoliberal thing. It's really the Democrats are reflecting that 1980s style of politics much more than the Republicans are. Because the Republicans now are just like, with Trump, the Republican id is just unleashed, and it's not camouflaged in politeness anymore. That's been ripped, that veneer's been ripped away from the Republicans. So I guess Trump was good for something. And the Democrats, right now, of course, with the primary that's going on, there's a war for the soul of the Democratic Party. Are we going to go back to neoliberal centrism, status quo? We need to return to normalcy and politeness and civility. Or are we actually going to have a real realignment of the political party, like around Bernie Sanders style politics? That will be, of course, very interesting to see. So that's kind of where we're at the end here of the very last day of the 2010s, right? So what do I think is going to happen? What do I think are going to be the biggest changes for me personally during the 2020s? Well, for me personally, I think probably the biggest change 2020s, at least I hope my biggest change of the 2020s for me on a personal level is I hope nothing bigger than me becoming a grandfather that decade happens. Because my older one is 17, so odds are decent that sometime before 2030 I'll be a granddad. Now, I hope it's a hell of a lot closer to 2030 than 2020. I don't know. I think 7 or 8 years from now would probably be about good, but who knows? It'll, I guess, happen when it happens, but let's hope it's closer to the end of the decade than the beginning of the decade, for obvious reasons. So there's that, and that, like I said, personally, that'll probably be the biggest thing that happens to me. At least I hope that's the biggest thing that happens to me, because other big changes that happen probably won't be positive, because they typically aren't, but we'll see. Who knows? I personally see my life kind of following a similar trajectory that it's been on. Of course, I'm going to stay in the IT field because it's the thing that I know the most about. I don't see myself changing careers to a totally different path. That's just not, because I'm not going to find anything that I'm as good at that's going to pay as much money. So there you go. I'm sure I'll continue this silly YouTube channel until I don't feel like it anymore. God only knows when that'll be. I guess when I get sick of it. Those are my predictions for myself in the 2020s. I'm leaving them kind of vague because, well, of course, we all know the future is completely unwritten, and who knows how it's going to turn out. As far as what I see social trends go, well, I see this decade we have two directions we can go. As I'm only going to talk about the U.S. Sorry, rest of the world. I'm not nearly as familiar with what's going on, so only talk about the U.S. We have two ways we can go, right? We can go, in my opinion, the wrong direction, which is we keep doing the same old crap, right? And that is we either A, re-elect Donald Trump and continue on kind of that, in my opinion, completely failed standard Republican orthodoxy, and probably have a recession, and things go. Climate change continues to not be addressed, and the world continues to burn, and we just keep doing status quo, or we elect like Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren as the Democrat, and status quo just continues on, and nothing really changes, nothing really gets any better, and things just continue to grind us down and get a little bit worse every year, a little bit worse, a little bit worse, a little bit worse, a little bit worse, until eventually we have a bloody revolution on our hands. Now, I'm not saying it'll happen in the 2020s necessarily, but if things don't start to get better, I can see that happening at some point. I'm not saying the 2020s. I'm not predicting I'm not that sort of a conspiracy theorist, but I can see that happening eventually if the status quo does not change. Or we can go a better direction. And that, of course, is nominating, in my opinion, the correct choice, Bernie Sanders for president, because if he gets the nomination, I don't think Trump stands a chance in hell of beating him. That's just my personal opinion. Um, I could be completely wrong, but if he were to get the presidency, I think it would. I think he would be the most influential president since Reagan, because if he were to get in there, he would completely shift the Overton window uh, back to the left. He would change the national conversation about everything, even more than he already has. He's already had a gigantic impact, but if he were president, just imagine the impact that he would have. And I think we would really start to look at our system, and I think it would fundamentally get transformed. Hopefully for the better. I mean, of course, I could be wrong about all of this. These are just my personal opinions. So right now, we have a choice to make. Are we going to make the right one? I hope so. I know, I couldn't help but throw that political crap in there, so whatever. If you hate it, feel free to flame me or whatever in the comments. So anyway, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane with me, and I'm going to conclude by saying to everyone out there, Happy New Year. I wish everyone the best in 2020 and the decade beyond. Thanks so much for watching. Live long and prosper.